So right now we have all these different workflows that are categorized by different package levels and also different packaging operations. So if you go to, I'm going to just work locally on my laptop because it's faster, but if you were to go to Publications and Solution Summaries, you'll see a folder called Packaging Integration Module. If you go in there, you're going to see a list of all of these PDF files that are basically it's basically a solution summary of what that module does. And as you can see, each module or PIM has a unique number assigned to it. The number, the logic in the number is not earth-shattering, so basically anything starting with a 1 means it's a unit level operation. Anything starting with a 2 means it's a bundle operation, 3 a case, and 4 is a pallet, and so forth. So essentially, this is our library of solutions that a customer can pick from. So the idea is the sales team would walk through these different solutions and try to find one that fit the customer's requirements. Now, when you open up one of these documents, the solution summary, it's basically, they're all formatted the same way, so we keep consistency. So you're going to kind of see the PIM number, and then you're going to see a description of what that module is doing. So for this example here, this PIM 110 is used to serialize unit level cartons. And basically for each module, there are certain things that we require, and then there are other things that are just going to be add-ons for the customer if they want to. So for example here, in this workflow, each solution summary will have a workflow that'll call out what the options are and what's actually required. So for this specific module here, if the very minimum what you want to do is you want to be able to serialize cartons, then for this module you require a print operation, which is number 1 here, and you require an inspection operation after the print has been applied to the module. So at a very minimum, if you want to serialize, you got to be able to print on a carton and you got to inspect that carton. Once we do both of those operations, then we're able to commission it. Now, with this specific module, there are other things that you could do as add-ons, which are determined here during this sales phase. So for example, if you have a very, very small carton, a customer may not be able to fit a data matrix and all of the text that they want on one flap because the carton could be very small. So in a situation like that, what customers typically do is they'll print the 2D and the serial number information on one flap, and then they'll print potentially like lot number and expiration date on another flap. So there is an option here in this module to print on the secondary flap of the carton, which is step 2 here. And as you can see, that's denoted as an option. And then there are some regulations that require, let's say, a label attached. So a lot of like the European regulations, for example, require like a vignette label. So for that type of operation, we have the option to apply a label to the carton. And then downstream here, as you can see, anything that we're applying or printing, obviously we're going to want to inspect. So there's options to inspect the label and options to inspect the secondary flap. So essentially the customer would walk through this, figure out what they needed. And then on the second page, we typically have some information regarding the inspection itself. So for example, if we're inspecting a data matrix on a carton, we need that data matrix to be a certain size. Okay. So what we do typically here is we give you a little table that tells the customer what size the data matrix needs to be. So for example, if for this module, if you're printing a data matrix and you're encoding, let's say 43 alphanumeric characters, then your module size needs your data matrix size needs to be a 5.5 millimeter. So this way, the customer could start determining, hey, does that fit my carton? Do I have the print space on the carton to fit that code size? In addition, besides what the code size needs to be, the other important aspects of the inspection are the field of view. So what is the field of view that our camera needs to be able to read everything, and also the standoff distance, right? So this is a situation where we need the camera to be a certain distance away from the product. Does it fit in the machine? So for each one of these, we typically provide several options. So for example, as you can see here, our standard option is what we call the V1, which provides a 62 by 46 millimeter field of view, and it requires this standoff distance. Now we do have some other options that we know not everything fits the V1. So for example, the V2 was specifically created for NEARI machines because as you can see, their standoff distance is much shorter. So for that particular solution, we use prisms to allow the camera to be a lot closer to the product, and the camera is actually mounted in a vertical fashion. And then there are some other options as well. So like for example, a V4 we typically use for Mettler machines. Again, because it requires it even to be closer than the NEARI machine. So essentially, a customer or the solution consultant, or if the PE was involved during the sales phase, would look at this table and try to determine which vision application worked the best for them. Once they reviewed the document and all of their choices were selected, then at the bottom of the page, there is a selection guide on how you quote the solution. And it's basically just ones and zeros in terms of what you're enabling or not. So for example, in this solution here, if I wanted to quote a PIM 110 with the bare minimum no options, right, that would mean that my solution would be HSM 110, which is the number of the PIM, and then you start just looking at the guide. So this number here is your component code inspection. So if you require a camera to do component code, you would put a 1. If you don't need that option, you would put a 0. The second spot here is your top label inspection, so same idea. If you required a top label, you would put a 1. If you didn't, you would do a 0. And the last one here is secondary flap. So essentially, when you fill this out, this will give you the part number kit that will have everything you need for that solution. So what this does is, in the past, when we did quotes, people actually had to line item everything, right? So every single part that you needed, someone would have to sit there and kind of put all the parts together. And what that led to was just a lot of errors because people would just forget to put stuff. So essentially, this is trying to make the lives of the sales team easier because as long as they follow this grid, that'll give them a part number kit that will give them everything they need: the lighting, the lensing, the camera cables, VICs, POEs, everything you need. And then this number is then also used throughout the whole process, which I'll get to in a bit. So going back to what I was saying in my example, if I wanted to have the bare bones of this PIM, it would be HSM 110 000, and then the V typically means what station design do you want. So if you go back up here to this table, for this particular one, we've highlighted four examples: V1, V2, V3, V4, and for each one we've given the field of view and the standoff, so you basically select from that table which one you need. So you select what options you want to enable, and then after the V, you select which station design you want. In this one, if we were doing the standard one, it would be V1. So your part number would be HSM 110 000 V1. Basically, the sales team would repeat that operation for any other PIN that they wanted. So for example, they just selected how they're going to serialize carton. Now, if they needed to do aggregation on that line as well, then they would go with, let's say if they needed to do case aggregation, then they would go down to all of our case solutions. And then we have different case solutions, you know, pack by layer in a side-load case packer, doing in-feed inspections in a side-load case packer, manual operations, doing manual pack by layer, and then even going down to very, very basic operations, doing just full scanners for aggregation. So for example, if I open up PIM 380, which is basically the most vanilla PIM that you could have, maybe some customers don't want to spend a lot of money on the solution. This is all a way, this solution is based off of being able to aggregate kids to a case, but just using scanners. So as you can see here, in this specific operation here, there's an operator. There's basically an operator here who is applying manually the labels to a case. They are then using a scanner to scan that case label, and then they are scanning each individual item into the case. And then when they're done, there's a stack light here that indicates to the operator that they're done with that case. So that is a very, very elementary type of operation, but it is also one of our most popular, probably because it's not costly. And then in terms of the options here, so for example, if we're printing case labels, there is an option to add a camera to inspect that label. So some customers, what they've done is, if they have like a desktop printer, what they do is they attach almost like this peel plate where the label comes out of the desktop printer, and then it's on a peel plate presented to the camera, and the camera can take a picture to read the entire label. So again, that's not required for this solution. It's an option that you could add on. And the same approach then would apply for the back page, right? So when you go down here to the criteria, there are certain options you could enable, one of them being the case label option. Any questions on any of that related to just the solution summaries? And this is how essentially the sales team is picking the solutions. Right now, it was manual for a while. Then we had RG3 tool, which was a tool that automated it. So it asked the sales team a series of questions, and based on the questions, it actually told the user what the solution was, what solution you needed. And we're making an effort to kind of bring that back, to have the sales team use that automation tool again. So I'll open it up for any questions related to the solution summaries or anything during this phase. Any questions, or is it pretty straightforward? Go ahead, Dennis. Good. Makes sense? Okay. Okay. So besides picking the pins, then obviously the only other thing that the sales team would need to pick would be the hardware that these pins are running on. So right now, there are several different hardware platforms that a sales team could pick, and that would be under our hardware support module. So if you go back into that same publications folder for solution summaries, in that same folder, there's another folder called hardware support module. If you go in there, then you'll see all the different platforms that we support. Now, over the last couple years, you're probably just familiar with the first generation, which was HSM 001 generation, which was the IPC. So I'll start with that one first, and then I'll just talk a little bit about the new hardware platform that's coming out soon, if not already. So for the original HSM series, this is the one where we supply the IPC. There's essentially 4 options that our customer could pick for what you want the platform to be. First one is what we call HSM 001, and essentially this is what you're seeing there, the panel, right? So this is where we supply the panel that goes on the packaging line, and then we take all of our components and we fit that in the panel. This is primarily done when there is no room in the OEM panel to put our stuff. The preferred option is always to put our equipment in the OEM panel, just because that means there's there's less real estate that our solution takes up, right? Because it's all nicely integrated into the OEM panel, but there are several situations where that's not possible, so we supply our panel for that. The other options are what we call HSM 002. So HSM 002 basically means we're going to supply all of the components, so the IPC, the UPS, network switches, power supplies. We're still going to supply all those components, but we're not going to supply it in the panel. We're actually just going to supply them as pieces, and then the OEM is going to go ahead and take those and put them into their panel, right? So we're just not supplying the stainless steel enclosure. HSM 003 is a situation where the OEM is still mounting our components in their panel, but instead of us giving them loose components and they got to mount it, we're actually providing them a basically a backplate with everything already mounted. So if you open up the HSM 001 panel, you'll basically, this is kind of what it looks like inside, the guts without any components. So this backplate here with all the DIN rail and everything, this is essentially what we provide them for HSM 003. So it's basically a plate with all the components already mounted, and then the only thing the OEM needs to do is worry about mounting the plate, and that's it. They don't have to worry about mounting each component. So a lot of the OEMs like this because it's a lot easier for them to mount our stuff. So HSM 003 is essentially the same plate that we use with HSM 001. It's just minus the stainless steel enclosure. And then the last option is HSM 004, which is the same idea as 003. It's the same base plate. It's just a smaller footprint because it's typically, we created this specifically for the EMA. I'm sorry, not the EMA, for the NERI BL400 machines because they have a smaller footprint. So typically what NERI does is they take this HSM 004 backplate and they stick it on the top of their machine. And again, it eliminates us having to provide a panel for that solution. So that's essentially what they would do in terms of picking the solution. They would pick their platform and then pick the pins. And then there are some HMI options as well. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with this. So we could either provide a local HMI, which is the HMI that sits right on top of our panel, or we could provide remote HMIs, which are basically, using the KVM, they're mounted somewhere remotely, typically maybe on an arm or something that's provided by the customer or the OEM. So that's essentially how you pick a solution, right? So you pick your platform and your pin. So now that gets processed through, and now it becomes a project. So essentially when the PE now gets a project that's been quoted, they look at the quote and they see now all of these different pins and hardware platforms that have been picked. So now what they start doing to create the documentation, essentially the whole engineering package for the project is in the engineering drive, there's a folder called Enterprise Serialization, and then in there there's a release folder. Essentially in there we have every file, whether it's configuration file, a drawing, a station design, documents, validation, anything that PE would need to complete the project could be found there. Now, all of these documents and files are all in template form, meaning when a PE gets the project, it's not literally just picking the file and just sending it to the customer. There are certain things that they have to do to the document, to the configuration, to the file to customize it for the project. So we'll start first with the core. So it's essentially broken up into core and PIMs. I'll start with PIMs first because that's the easiest. So PIMs are essentially a full list of every single PIM that we support. So for every single PIM that you saw a solution summary for, there's a file that contains all of the support files that you need when deploying that PIM. The core is essentially everything that doesn't fit into a PIM. So like I'll give you some examples. So for example, think of our function of reports, right? So our advisor software provides reports. We could do lot reports, we could do serialization reports, we could do a whole audit log reports, we could do a whole bunch of reports. All of those reports are not dependent on a PIM, right? So whether I'm doing a automatic pack by layer solution, or I'm doing a manual pack by layer solution, or I'm doing a PIM 110, I don't care what PIM I'm doing, the reports are essentially always the same, right? The audit log report's always the same. Same thing with in-lot rework, right? So when you do in-lot rework on a system, in-lot rework is always the same. It's not really dependent on how many cameras you have and stuff like that. So all of these core functions of the system that every serialization job has, we wrap that all into what we call the core. And in the core, we basically have a core DDS that describes all of those features. So if I open up the core, there's essentially two parts of a core, right? There's the line core, which is everything I just described, and there's the site core, which is related to Guardian. So if you open up the site core first, we provide document templates for all of the versions, right? So if I go to 740, what I'll see is I'll see a list of DDSs for Guardian 740 for the different types of, let's say, provisioning that we provide. So for example, if I have a project and I'm getting numbers from SAP PI system, then there's a DDS for Guardian specific for that application. And in that document, a lot of the settings that we pre-configure in the document are specific for that configuration that's required for that PI provisioning. All of our documents are structured the same way in that when you first open up the template, there's instructions on how to fill out the template. So typically what the instructions are is there is a set of document properties that need to be filled. So these are just properties that are just normal stuff, right? So what's the client name? What's the client location? What's the project number? Who's the project manager? So just stuff that, normal stuff that's going to change from every project. So basically the PE goes to document properties, and they would essentially just fill out all those properties in there, right? So when you go to document properties, all of these properties appear there. So you would basically fill out the ones that are called out. In addition, in the document, there's certain sections that are in black, and there's certain sections that are in red. The sections that are in red are meant to be changed in project, and the sections that are in black are not meant to be changed. So basically anything in black means we need that to be fixed, or else we actually could break the solution, where the ones in red are things that we know are going to change during a project. And then we have a template revision history. So basically the PE would take this document, they would go through it. Each part that requires the PE to do something, we typically will have. So each part that requires the PE to do something, what we do is we will typically highlight the section in red, and then we will supply an instruction in blue, which we call a templater, to say, hey, you need to pay attention to this section. You have to do something, whether it's deleting something or picking something. You have to do something in this section, and essentially, that's what the template alert says. So, for example, in this particular example here, we are highlighting a section about how we're provisioning. So we're basically saying, if you're not doing any sort of manual provisioning for this project, remove this text. So someone would remove this if they're not doing manual provisioning, right? We don't want to put things related to manual provisioning if we're not doing it, because then it confuses not only the customer, but you guys, right? So essentially you guys are also the receiver of this document. You're going to look at all of the documents to figure out what the solution is doing. So we want to make sure the document represents exactly what we're doing and not putting extra stuff in there. So that's essentially how the PE would fill out the document for Guardian, right? Same idea. These are some settings, right? So we put in the default in red, but again, we want you to go in there and pay attention and pick the stuff that you need. So like I said, for Guardian, we had a Guardian DDS and a Guardian validation document. And the validation document will follow a very similar structure for Guardian. Same idea, where we have a bunch of steps, and it requires some modifications or deletions of the steps based on what applies or not. Now, in general, and I want to get to validation a little bit later and get your feedback on it. But in general, the validation documents from a PE perspective always take a little bit more time because where for some of the design docs, it's very straightforward on, for example, are you doing pre-printed cartons or are you doing online printed cartons? It tends to be, and I'll show you a little bit, very straightforward on what to do with the document, where with the validation, it's a little bit tougher to kind of standardize that and make it very straightforward for them because the validation is dependent on the number of classes you have, right? So if you have 15 classes, right, what we typically do is we provide the scripts and the test scripts for one class, but a P then may have to reproduce that for every single class because the customer may want to test every single class they have on their line. But as you can see, it's structured in the same way where we basically have as much of the pre-populated test scripts that we can, and then there are either certain steps or sections that have to be addressed depending on your configuration. So just looking at the one that I have here, for example, this section here is a section where we're checking the configuration of the notification rule in Guardian to make sure that it matches with the DDS. So for this example here, we're telling the PE that you delete this section if you don't have a third notification rule. So there are some customers who have multiple notification rules. So for example, if I'm producing products for China, I may want my Guardian at the end of a lot to send the information, the serialization information to my SAP system. So that's notification rule number one. And then also to generate an SSDA file, which would be notification rule number two. So you could definitely have multiple notification rules in a Guardian. So we lay out here all of the different test scripts for all the different notifications. So you would essentially, if you don't have a third notification, then you would just delete this section, right? Because it would not make sense. So a lot of that same stuff applies throughout the document for the VQ. Now, on the line side, the same principles apply, where we basically have three folders for the line core. We have a config folder, a document folder, and a drawing folder. Starting with the config folder first, if you go in there, what you'll find is baselines and IPS files related just to the core. So if we open up baselines first, these are all the baselines that every PE starts off with, and they're basically based on different scenarios. So we have a baseline that is advisor only. So there are some customers who like to have an advisor standalone. And when I say standalone, I mean there's no pins or cameras or stuff connected to it. So it's basically just an advisor that is, you're receiving information from Guardian and then passing information off to remote sentries. It doesn't do any sort of vision operation. So there's a baseline for that. There's a baseline for advisor sentry on one box. There's a specialty baseline that is advisor sentry item only. So this is for a situation where maybe a customer is just doing, they're just doing EU regulation, right? So they want to support EU regulation, which requires unit level serialization only, and that's it, right? So there's no bundle aggregation, no case aggregation, nothing. So for something like that, we would typically have one system that's just doing a unit level PIM. So what we've created is a baseline that is advisor sentry item level only because it removes a lot of the other stuff that's not required for bundle and case aggregation. So we don't have any case aggregation, camera station, aggregation screen, in-lot rework, all that stuff that you would need for aggregation, we took it all out. Now, that's not to say that a PE could start with the advisor sentry baseline and then just remove all that stuff out manually, but we've already pre-canned that in this baseline, that way to save the PE some work. We have a remote in-lot rework baseline, so that's for situations where a customer has an in-lot rework station, but it's not part of the advisor, it's a remote station. There's an ES remote sentry baseline, and then there's a sentry item level only baseline. So again, all of the baselines are here, and the P starts off with those. And then those are all maintained for new features. So for example, in 740, there was a new way to do date conversion. So it eliminates the date conversion script that's done. So we updated the baseline to get rid of the date conversion script and use the new date conversion that's provided with Device Manager. So we update these as needed based on the new functionalities that are being introduced into the system. In terms of document templates, so there's a PDF, there's a configuration document, and then there's a suite of validation documents. So I'll start off with the DDS first. So DDS, same thing, right? So the instructions to the P on the front end are version history, right? So we know exactly all the changes that have been done to this document. And then it's your core line DDS. So some of the topics that we cover in here, like I said, are basically related to things not related to a PIM. So we give you an overall architecture of the whole line. So if you want to know exactly what the entire line looks like, that picture is here. This should really come out of just directly from the quote, unless anything changed. So as long as the scope of the quote was correct, this could just literally be dropped right from the quote in here. It should match. Then we get into some of the topics and functions that are, like I said, are core. So for example, master data download, which I think you guys are going to get training on later today, that's covered in the core DDS. Packaging work order downloads, that's another feature that is new to 740 that allows you to get packaging work order information from Guardian as opposed to from another MES system. And again, as you can see, a lot of these are in red because if you're not using it, then we're going to ask the P to strip it out. So that's why you're seeing the all in red. And then we also typically provide instructions on what version you need it on, right? So if you wanted to use packaging work order download, then we put in the instructions that it does require a minimum software version of 740. So if you're on 736, you can't use packaging work order download. It's not an available feature in that software. We go over any sort of TIPS remote. So if you're familiar with TIPS remote, this is a functionality that we provide that allows an external system, like an MES system, to send us, to select a product and send us batch variable information remotely. So someone doesn't have to go on the advisor and pick a product manually and enter the information. So we provide all of the functionality and interface details as to how that works in this document. LCD import, again, it's another function that allows you to start a lot of different ways. So this is a situation where maybe a customer prints the information on a batch record, and what a operator would do is they would scan the batch record, the barcode, to get the information into the system. So there would be a barcode printed with the lot number, one with the expiration date, and again, it's to avoid the operator typing it in where there could be typos. We talk about the advisor to remote operator connection, how different ways to start a lot is covered, suspend and resume, power fail, different ways to end a lot, right? So we could end a lot manually. The lot could be ended remotely using that MES system. So again, I kind of talked about the different ways, and the P would actually select which way they're using. We talk about QA operations and in-lab rework. So these are all the different functions that you could do in the system, right? So the decommissioning, the repack, the removing children, building a new parent. So each one of those functions are covered here in the system. We talk about the reports that I talked about earlier. the audit log, how to create archives and the fact that we can't create archives, and then security, right? So we don't provide a matrix of every single button and every single state. So for some of you old timers, we used to provide a navigation guide. And the screen navigation guide was basically a matrix of every single button and then what state that button was available in. Now that has some pros and cons. A lot of the cons that we got feedback on was that because we provided a document that said these are all your 120 buttons on the software and these are all the states, then it required you guys to actually validate that. So you would actually have to try to validate every single button for every single state. And the feedback was that that was actually a nightmare to kind of try to do that in the field. So we tried to move away from that and do more of a function-based security. So what we do in the DDS now is we lay out all of the different security groups you could have, and not so much what buttons they get, but just in general what functions they can do. So for example, an operator should be allowed to select a product. They should be allowed to start and resume a lot. They should be able to view the runtime counts, go to QA, do a device recovery. A supervisor should be able to do everything the operator does and maybe be able to do, view alarms, in-lot rework, maybe decommission stuff. So we're trying to go more to a function-based layout for the security, and this actually, if we show you the validation document, then the validation document is more geared towards that. So it'll say log in as an operator, and then make sure that, start a lot, and then make sure you could do these things. So it's trying to make it easier for you guys to be able to run that instead of having to, because we were having some people actually go into like screen edit mode and then have to go to every single button in screen edit mode and look at the state and show the customer the state that were correctly configured. So it's just kind of a nightmare. Now, with that said, from what I understand, I think that there still are some customers who actually want the navigation guide. So I think those right now will have to be kind of treated as an off, one-off for now. Fine, right? Yeah. I just want to. I need some power.
I got a question for you.
Okay.
Trace matrix. When is that going to go into play?
I'll get it to that at the end. We'll show you a sample. Right now, we're in the process of delivering it to some customers, 5 or 6 of them, and they're going to give us feedback later this month. So I was trying to give you guys like a 10-minute rundown of that at the end. So with that said, what you're going to see is each of the documents that you're going to start seeing is they're each going to start having this little green number here. You'll start seeing them throughout different sections of the document. This number here is being used for the trace matrix, which I'll cover at the end. The reason that we needed to insert these numbers to do traceability for the documents is because by nature, because these are templates, we couldn't reference the actual section number and name because people are deleting sections as part of the exercise to make it project specific. So when you delete the section, that throws off all your numbers. So we couldn't refer to the section numbers to trace everything, so we had to put in unique IDs to allow customers to trace. So I'll get to that at the end and kind of show you a sample of that. So that's the DDS. The config spec basically covers just that, right? How the system is configured. And this will kind of apply to the same way to all the PIMs. So for each PIM, we have a design doc, right, that shows you how the PIM is designed, and then a config document on how the PIM is configured. And the same applies here for the core. So some of the things that we cover here are basically related to, like I said, things that are not specific to the PIM. So how are your classes configured, right? So that's not really relative to a PIM. That's just basically what is your class structure. So we detail here for each system what the class structure is, right? So the advisor has these 5 classes, maybe the Sentry has these 2, and so forth. And then we kind of try to lay out where all of the PIMs reside on every system, right? So the advisor may have a PIM 311 and 410, your Century 1 may have a PIM 210, and your Century 2 may have a PIM 110, for example. Then your products, right? So how are all your products, what are their names and descriptions, right? That has to, at some point, the PE has to know what to put into the system. So this is the place where all the products information is captured. Product data. So product data is an interesting one because product data basically means for every single product that we put into the system, there are certain things that we need to know about it, right? So for a given product, we need to know what's the GTIN of that product. What's the name of the print file that that product uses for each level, right? So it could be a print file for the unit, print file for the case, for the pallet. How many cartons go in a bundle? How many bundles go in a case? How many cases go in a pallet? So all of that information, which is a lot of information, right now we're referencing out to some sort of data sheet. Now that data sheet could be the one that we provide, or sometimes what customers do, like I know Pfizer is good with this, is Pfizer already standardized their own data sheet, and basically when they start a project, they just give us that data sheet and it has everything we need. Some of these data sheets could be massive, so if you have some lines that are running like 200 products for 20 different markets, it's massive. So that's why we didn't want to stick that in the document because it's from a formatting perspective, it's a nightmare. So we usually just reference out to this data sheet, which is typically like an Excel sheet. It's going to be this long table with all this information. This is a lot of the data collection that you hear about that takes a lot of time, right? So to be able to get a customer to, one, understand what we need, and then two, be able to provide it, this is the part that actually will take many meetings and many months to get all this information from. Now, some of the customers, like I said, Pfizer, that have already worked with us a long time, they know what we need, so they already have that stuff prepped for us. But some of the newer customers, it requires a lot more hand-holding to get all this information. But essentially, it's just the document is just saying that all of that information is going to be stored in this data sheet. All of our lot control variable information, right? Configuration, right? So at some point, the P has to configure the lot control variables, right? So are there going to be any maps for the lot control variables, right? Maybe class 1 has a map for the lot number that's 5 digits, but class 2 has one that's 8 digits. Again, all that information from a traceability standpoint has to reside somewhere, right? It can't be in people's heads. So again, we list that all out here. IP addresses, so this is just kind of IP addresses for the whole line. This one you can make the argument that, you could say that some of the IP addresses for the specific printers may reside at the PIN level, but we wanted just to give someone kind of a snapshot of all the IP addresses for the whole line. So that's kind of why we put that in there. And then basically what you're going to see in all of our configuration documents is the actual IPS file. So this is something new. In our old document style, we never used to do this. So kind of what IPS configuration you were using was always kind of not possible to determine from the document. So here, what we've done is all of the IPS files that we provide, we actually snapshot them as a screenshot and put them in the document. And what the P is supposed to do is they're supposed to select the one that applies to them. So for example, this one here is used for manual palletizing, right? So if I'm doing manual palletizing, there's actually an IPS configuration that runs in the background to be able to print the label and do all that jazz. So we typically will provide all different options that we can think of that may be used. So for example, if you're doing manual palletizing where the pallet label is being printed online, then not only do we need to know that it's being printed online, but also we need to know the format that the number is coming down from Guardian. So this IPS stream here will let you print pallet labels online, and it assumes that you're receiving SSCC 96 numbers from Guardian. So this is the one that you would pick. Now, the way that we typically create our IPS stream is we, one, try to make everything very uniform in terms of We try to make everything very uniform in terms of the description and the name. So everything will be very uniform. So, sometimes a lot of times in the past when configurations were configured, like there would be no descriptions to them. It would just be just a block, right? So you would just kind of see the block name, but then it's harder to figure out what is this stream configuration doing. So for all of these, what we've done is we put in a uniform name, and then we put in a description telling you what that specific block is doing in the context of the screen. So again, it's to kind of help with the training. So, if you're running into an issue and you can't figure out what it is, or even if you're not in the field, and maybe you have some downtime, which I know you guys have very rare downtime, but if you wanted to kind of go through these streams and kind of try to follow along and see what the stream is doing, it should help you with trying to figure out or get more handle on IPS. But essentially, you would see what IPS configuration is running for that system, for that class. So again, this is also class-driven, right? So you could have a class that's doing, Brazil, which may have a certain number format, and then you could do a class that's doing China, which have another number format. So that's why, as you can see here, this is per class. So we expect the PE to show you the configuration per class. And then, like I mentioned, then there's different flavors you could pick from. So, for example, if you were doing SFCC formatting, you would pick this one. If you were doing any sort of pre-printed palette label, you would pick this one. So essentially, they pick the one that they need. And I'm not going to go through every other section, but every other section kind of covers the same thing, where it covers bundle rework, case rework, and palette rework. Same idea. They would pick which one they need based on their use case. And then lastly then is we provide a VQ for the core that covers all of the testing for that. Now, the line core is the only one that's a little bit different, where typically what you'll find is it's a one-to-one-to-one, meaning at the PIM level, it's, there's a PIM design document, there's a PIM config document, and then there's a PIM validation document, so it's a one-to-one-to-one. The core is the one that's a little bit different. There's a series of validation documents for the core, just because there's so much material that it was natural to just kind of break it up. So the first core document is 001, and what this covers is it'll cover all of those core sections. So, for example, the first.
For some, the double arrow on the GoToMeeting right next to it.
Okay. So the document is broken up into two parts, so IQ and OQ. So typically, Systech will be responsible for doing an IQ. IQ stands for installation qualification, making sure that the system is installed correctly, right? So is my system configured correctly? Is my system wired correctly? Or is my cameras mounted correctly? So everything related to the installation. Does it have the right software version? So that's typically what that will cover. And then the second portion is the operation qualification, the OQ, and essentially is the system doing the functions that we want it to do? The last part of validation is the PQ. It's called performance qualification. Systech typically will not be involved in that because that tends to be a little bit more pertaining to the customer. So where the installation qualification and the operational qualification, that's very more static, right? Is the system installed correctly? Yes. Is the system behaving as it should? Yes. That's more straightforward. Performance qualification, PQ, is more specific to the customer, and each customer may have different criteria. And a lot of that performance qualification may also have to do with the customer's SOP, so they want to see how the system performs in the customer world with their SOP. So typically, we don't get involved in that, so we only get involved in the IQ, OQ. So going back to that, like I said, the document is broken up into IQ and OQ, and like I said, IQ sections that will test one, we want to make sure that we verify the documents. So do we have all the documents in workflow. Two, is the system installed, wired, and cabled correctly? Three, do we have all the software versions installed correctly? Four, are all of our connections for communication there? And then we get into the configuration. Are the classes configured correctly? Are the products configured correctly? And stuff like that. Once we get into the operational aspect of it, that's where we get into the functions. So things like security, right? So is the advisor demonstrating the security that we called out in the design doc? And this is where you actually log in as all the different users, operator, security, supervisor, and make sure that those functions are available. We cover the audit log, right? So make sure that we could capture events in the audit log, that we could generate a report, stuff like that. We get into all the different ways to be able to start a lot, right? So, which is, yeah, here, right? So you could start a lot using master data download. You could do manual start lots. Automated start lots, so manual start lot down here. So basically we cover all that stuff that I talked about in the core PDF. And then we also cover like suspend and resume and power loss and things like that. So then the document, again, as similar as the other ones, there are certain things in red with the instructions for the template alert, right? So this is what the PE fills out again. But again, they're not creating new test scripts. They're basically using the test scripts that exist today and just either deleting or updating certain things, but they're not creating test scripts from scratch. Again, which is good because we want to keep that consistency from project to project. Especially it's important for you guys because you guys are just jumping all around from project to project without any background information on that project. So again, if we keep it consistent, it should help you guys do your job. And then, like I said, the other ones are more specific. So 001 is kind of related to like reports and security and that stuff. 003, Nadia, remind me, is related
manual palletizing.
Is manual palletizing. So anything related to manual palletizing is 003. 004 is in-lot rework. So it's a test script all related to in-lot rework functions. And 005 is all related to reports, right? Making sure that our reports work. Last thing I'll cover before I move on to the PIMs, we'll go over a little bit here because we started late, is we provide drawings. So the drawings that we provide are there's two types. There's the hardware and there's the electrical or connection. So for the hardware, this pretty much is static, so the P's really don't do much with these, I don't think. So for example, we have the HSM 001, 002, 003, and 004, and these are just mechanical, right? So it just kind of shows what the different dimensions are of all of our components, right? So this is more for the OEMs and for the customer, if they need to kind of plan out the space on their line, they may want to know how big our panel is, right? So this just kind of shows dimensional stuff for all the different dimensions for the panel, the layout of the panel, the IPC. You want to jump in?
We update page number 3 to reflect exactly what is installed and where it's installed.
Gotcha. So for this drawing, the base one shows all of the different components that you could potentially have in one, right? So we show four different PoE switches, power supplies, VIX. This is fully loaded, and the P will delete the ones that they don't use, right? So to represent that. And then we go into a sheet for every single component, right? So this is the dimensions of the power supply, this is the dimensions of the PoE switch, and the VIC, and so forth. And the VIC, and so forth. Now for the connection drawings, we have the same 4 platforms that I described in the solution summary. So it was the 001, 002, 003, and 004. So when I go to 001, I'll see there's 2 types of drawings. There's an advisor drawing. So if my 001 is an advisor, then it needs to have certain connections. So for example, if it's an advisor, it may need to have connections out to remote sentries, right? If I have 3 remote sentries, I have to show that connection. It may need to show a connection to Guardian. It may need to show a connection to an in-lap rework printer, stuff like that, which if my 001 is a sentry, I wouldn't have any of those connections. So that's why we have 2 of them. And then when you open up the drawing, the way that the drawings are set up is they're pre-configured with most of the connections, and then some of the choices you have to make are what we call layers. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with AutoCAD, but layers are basically a way to make a choice, and then it could flip the drawing for you. Because you basically create different permutations of the drawing, and then based off of the selection you make, it'll display that portion. So to give you an example. So the core drawing will typically not have anything to do with cameras. That's what we put at the PIM level. So what the core drawing will have is it'll show the power supply, it'll show the IPC, it'll show the line switch for connections like the remote sentry connection, like I said, the rework printer, stuff like that. It'll show the HMI, right? So what type of HMI you have. So for example, here, in our layer selection here, you can see there's a series of different drop downs. And one of the choices that you can make is your HMI, right? So is your HMI a local HMI? Do I have a local and remote? Do I have just a remote, or do I have 2 remotes? So basically, based off of the choice they make here, that'll actually invert the drawing to show that. So right now I'm showing a local connection. If I were to uncheck this and show a local and remote, the drawing now has changed to show a local HMI here, and now it shows the KVMs and the connections for the remote here. If I were to select just the remote, again, as you can see, the drawing changes, and now it just shows the remote connection. It doesn't show the local. So again, it's trying to, 1, eliminate errors, and 2, make it quicker for the PEs to generate it. We are actually working on automation drawing wizards that are very close to being released. You may have seen some emails on it where basically it asks the PE a series of questions, and then based off of the questions, it'll actually generate the drawing automatically for them and then create a PDF. So they don't have to do anything. It just answer the questions in the wizard. So that should be released soon. But we're starting to release some where we're actually doing like a bulk release of like many pins to support a bunch of them. So that's essentially what you would see in the core. Now at the PIM level, like I said, there's a big folder that has everything categorized by the PIM. So essentially what a PE would do is they would go to the PIM they needed. So let's say I'm doing an automatic tactile layer PIM 310 solution. Well, if they go in there and they double click, what they'll actually see is, remember going back to the solution summary when you had to make your choices to get you a part number? So let's say if it was like a 110000, there's a corresponding folder that just gives you the IPS files, documents, and everything you need for that option. So if I go back to, let's say, PIM 110, right, and I double click on that folder, here's now all the different options you could pick. So they would just pick the option that was quoted for that one. And when they go to that folder, now you have your documents and your configuration for that folder. So going back to 310, because that's a little bit more involved, so I think will be more useful. So for PIM 310, there's just 2 options. There's just an option whether or not you want a secondary case label inspection or you don't. So assuming that we don't, we would go to the 0 flavor, which is this flavor here. And then when you go in here, again, very similar, we'll give you configuration and document templates. Starting with the configuration first, what we typically do is we'll provide IPS files for that PIM. So the different flavors for this PIM, which is a tactile layer PIM, is really related to what number format you're using. So if you're using an 0121 format, we'll provide a file that does that. For each IPS file, we provide the IPS file itself, which is the file that goes into the baseline, and then a JPEG if you wanted to view it. So again, if you open up just the JPEG, that's actually the file that exists, right? So again, like I showed you with the other files, every file is version controlled, so we put a version on it, and again, it has a description of everything that it does. But essentially, this file here will do automatic pack by layer, right? So we don't need the P to create everything from scratch. So how this will help you, hopefully, is that as you go from project to project, you don't have to figure out from scratch what is happening. You should be able to have a conversation with the P to say, okay, you know, what PIM are you using? Okay, I'm using PIM 310, and that should give you an idea as to what the application is. And hopefully, as you start coming across more PIM 310s, you start knowing these like the back of your hand. Now, sometimes because we do retrofits, obviously there are some modifications that the P has to do that are kind of off the standard. So it should still help with the handover to you guys, because the P then should be able to say, hey, I'm using PIM 310, but I made these two modifications to it, right? So then you're only having to worry about the deltas and not the entire solution. So those are all the IPS files there. And then we also provide document templates, right? So the document templates are then specific to the PIM, right? So there's essentially three, right? There's the design doc, the config document, and the validation. So when you open up the design doc, again, it's everything related to just that configuration, that PIM. So it'll go through things like what the process flow is, and then different types of process flows, right, depending on what the choices are, a description of the process flow, what all the different inspections are, right? So we have a layer inspection. Well, what VIM, what station design is that inspection using? We have a case label printer. Okay, so what print driver are we using for that, right? Is it Bartender, is it Zebra, is it Markup? So here is where you look to see what is the print driver. Then we also provide information relating to the clear operations, right? So what type of clear operations does the PIM support? Do we support clearing pending cases, the entire case packer, stuff like that? Rework, right? So if a case gets rejected, what do you do with the carton? So that's where that's described there. Partials, right? So how are partials supported? So this example here for the pack by layer, there's actually two ways to support the partial. We can support it automatically, where the PLC tells us what the partial amount is, and then it does a partial automatically, or it could be supported manually using a pack now button. So that would be described here. And then we get into the interface section. So the interface section is really all for the OEM. And what it does is we tell the OEM how to program their PLC. So we give them another picture of the solution, but it's actually more detailed in terms of what we expect the OEM to do at every stage. So we'll actually tell them, you know, when you push a layer into the case, then you give us the signal, for example. In the next section, we then go through that same level of detail just in step form, right? So again, it's meant for the OEM to read this, understand what they need to do, right? So for example, case packer erects the case and places it in the pack position. After the case is in position, the case packer gives us the ready to pack case signal. And then the ready to pack case signal remains high for the duration of the case is in the pack position. On the receipt of the ready to pack case signal, the Systech system asserts the packing case. So it's essentially going step by step, everything that we expect the machine to do, and then everything our system will do. So again, we're trying to reinforce it. We show it in the process flow, we show it in text, and then we show it obviously in timing diagrams. So we'll show timing diagrams for all different types of scenarios, right? So this is the pack by layer timing for a single layer case. This is for a multi-layer case. And then we get into the exception handling, right? What happens if we're doing single layer and we do a layer retry? Well, this is what happens. This is very important for you guys when you're out in the field and something isn't working right. You want to go back to this. You want to make sure that we are able to confirm with the OEM that this is what they're following. A lot of times, if the OEM don't follow this, this is where the whole process breaks down and nothing works. So always step one, if something is not working and it's related to timing, you want to make sure this is being followed. Now, if this is being followed and we still have issues, then we probably have something wrong in our configuration. But a lot of the times, it could be something on the OEM side. So we want to work with them to make sure this is being followed. That's not to say we don't have to, blame them. Doing kind of high-level stuff. The PIM is doing everything related to the actual performance of that machine. So essentially, if you're in an OEM and you're doing some sort of machine testing, you're really just going to be worrying about one validation document, right? Because you're never going to have multiple PIMs on one machine. That's not possible. So basically, the way the PIM is structured, it's always going to be a one-to-one, a PIM per machine. So you're always essentially working with one design doc, one config doc, or one validation doc if you're at a given OEM or machine. For example, into layer, we start introducing defects and different types of defects, right? So we introduce the already packed child. If you introduce an already packed child, then we expect the system to behave a certain way, right? There'll be a red X that appears. Introduced, a case label with ineligible prints, then we expect the system to behave a certain way. So for each PIM, there's essentially normal operations testing, right? So make sure the whole process works correctly. The cartons are QA, they're aggregated, everything works fine, and then we start doing exception handling, right? Do different defects on the prints, do clears. Essentially, the way it's broken up, we're very much over time here. So
it's all right. I'll go over the traceability.
Yeah. So going over the so the idea with the traceability is traceability matrix is something that Systech typically has not done in the past, but we've done it sometimes when customers have asked for it. So the idea behind the traceability is, for those of you who don't know what traceability is, it's basically a way to have a set of requirements somewhere and then map those requirements to show exactly where they're covered in the design document and then exactly where they're tested in the test document. So it's a way to prove to the customer or the user that everything that we say we do, we're doing, and then we're also testing to make sure it works, right? So there's no gaps, right? They feel comfortable that everything we say we do, we're testing, and we're not testing something. It also helps with like upgrades. So for example, if a customer is doing an upgrade to a new version, we would be able to highlight to them to say, okay, this upgrade affects these certain functions of the software, and now we're able to show you these are the validation tests you have to run, right? So it's very transparent to them. It's not us just telling them what they need to run, but they actually follow themselves through the document. So that's why the idea of the traceability. The reason we didn't do it in the past is it's very time consuming. So there are companies that do this, and that's like their standard line of service, right? They do integration traceability. So someone like Barry Waymiller, right? They offer this as a service. So they'll dedicate teams to just doing traceability and validation work. We typically haven't done it in the past is because it just requires a lot of work, and we don't have the teams to have a person dedicated to work on traceability for one project for the next 5 months, right? RPs kind of bounce around between project and project. So the reason that we think we might be able to do it now is because the way everything is done with standard documents, now we can embed traceability within those documents, and it's kind of off the shelf. Now, the way we're pitching it to customers is you can have this off-the-shelf traceability. Now, if you want to trace to your customer-specific URS, that's out of scope. So that's a whole other thing. You have to engage Systech on that. And if we want to quote you 2 months to do that, then that's got to be a decision between Systech and them. Right. But yeah, I'm sure nobody else wants that. But if they want to use the off-the-shelf stuff, then that's something that we will supply as an off-the-shelf feature because it's there already. We already have the document. So essentially the way it would look is we already started engaging 5 or 6 different customers. So Baxter, AZ, Pfizer, Merck, Amgen, and another one I don't remember. So what we did is we supplied them a sample set that it would look like, their feedback to make sure it would work for them. So what we did is we took all of our documents and we just created a very typical sample project, right? We said this project is going to have Guardian, it's going to have an advisor, obviously, and it's going to have 2 pins, 110, a pack by layer pin, 352, and then manual palletizing. And then me and Nadia actually filled out the documents like we were like PE. And then what we delivered to them was a full document set for a project and the traceability matrix. So the traceability matrix looks like this. Now this is the one that they got, which was like, it was for that. Actually broken up into categories, right? You have your Guardian, which is your site, your line core, and then you have each pin. It is one massive table, right? And your traceability matrices are done. So typically there is a table. Now sometimes the only difference here is we actually put in the requirement description in the table itself. A lot of times for the customers, they'll have a URS that'll be just a list of requirements. And then the traceability matrix itself is just a table that shows all of the different number references across the document. So that's the only difference here, but essentially this gives you the same concept. We're going to have a specific URS ID, right? So this is the ID for the requirement. It's a unique number. We're going to list the requirement. Then we will tell you what document, what design or configuration document that requirement is in, the ID for that requirement. This section, this is more for us. So as you can see here, it says internal use only. It's a template section. This is really more for us to be able to map everything. The VQ document that the test is in, and then the test ID. So for example, looking at this one here, right? So the requirement for this one is that the system shall be able to request or provision serial numbers from an external management system. That's the requirement, right? So that requirement is found in our 310, which is our Guardian DDS. These are the sections that will cover that. These are just the template names. This is the document that tests it, and this is a specific document or a test ID that tests that requirement, that shows that we're testing, we're able to receive numbers from another system.
These are the green IDs that
the green IDs. Yep.
Seen before.
Correct. Requirement that we just showed traceability are functions, and some are IQOQ stuff, right? So say like this one here. This is an IQ one, right? The required line status codes shall be configured. So all of the line codes that are required for the line to run correctly, we want to test that, right? So for example, that one here will reside in a section in the DDS called line status codes, and then there's going to be a section in the DDS and the VQ to test that. So we show traceability there. So for example, if someone was doing an upgrade to a software, and we know that that upgrade maybe changes their line status code, then this is a section that we would call out as part of like the analysis to say, hey, you want to run this again to make sure everything works, right? So that's at the guard level. And then at a level, we have similar things, right? So at the line level, you know, there's a requirement here. This is an example that says the system shall allow a packaging lot to be suspended using an MES SCADA interface. So this is a situation where we had an MES SCADA system that was starting a lot remotely. Well, our interface allows you to suspend a lot using that interface. So that would test that. Now the idea is, as you can see, this traceability matrix for this project is 30 pages. This traceability is created from a global traceability matrix that Nadia is maintaining that has the requirements for every single PIM we support. So this thing is like massive, it's like 300 pages. And the way that the PE would build their project traceability is to extract the PIMs and stuff that they needed from that bigger traceability. And then obviously within the PIM, there may be some requirements that don't apply. You would need to remove those as well. But essentially, once you extracted the PIMs that you needed from your global and you removed the requirements you didn't need, then essentially you would come to this, right, where it would be just the requirements for their line. So again, what you wouldn't need to do is you wouldn't need to worry about the individual mappings or the numbers. That's already done for you. So it's a matter of just reading the requirements and removing the ones that don't apply. And then at the stuff, right? So we would have requirements for the PIM, right? So inspection, right? So because we're reading cartons in a case to aggregate, so we show mapping. Be kind of the same. Right? System shall allow carton detected in a layer while the layer is in progress, right? So this is basically saying if someone's doing a pack by layer and they find a failed carton, then we have the ability while the layer is still active to replace that carton. So that's kind of the idea with the traceability matrix. Like I said, right now, we pretty much have a good portion of it done. We're right now just in the middle of engaging with customers to get their early feedback. We don't want to just release it without getting feedback from customers first. So, you know, once we meet with the customers and get their feedback, then we'll probably determine what's the best path forward on that.
Will be affected by this, and we're going to do also.
I don't think it would. I don't think it would be part of anything you guys do. I think your role would remain the same in terms of helping them with the VQ. So I think it's mainly between the customer PD and the PM. Now, the one thing where this is going to be useful, where the only thing I can see where you guys would be brought in is kind of what I said is some of the customers, or a lot of the customers, when we talked to them about this, they saw this would be useful for upgrades. So a lot of the customers they're scared about upgrade because they're like, I just validated this thing. It took me many months. Now you're asking me to upgrade. Do I got to do the whole thing again? And one of the things that they saw they could use this for is yeah, if we're doing an upgrade from 736 to 740, if you guys can tell us which things are affected as part of some sort of impact analysis, then those are the only tests that we know we need to run. So that if you were on the field and you were doing an upgrade and they wanted to run those tests, you would probably have to have some coordination with like the project team. So either they would have to spit out or something so you know which ones are the ones you need to run. But it would be like a subset of the bigger ones you ran initially. So something like that would have to be done on a project per project basis. So like that impact analysis, there's no way for us as a standard to do that because every project is different. So you would have to kind of know what is deployed on that project and then compare that against your trace matrix and see what would be affected. That's basically all I got. So if we could just take 10 minutes, I just want to open this up to two things. Questions in general, And then two, I did want to bring Nadia into here because so Nadia does all of our validation templates, and we wanted to just get feedback from you guys in terms of just one, how do you guys typically use the validation documents in terms of like when you're doing validation on a site somewhere, like is the customer actually filling out the validation? You guys are just like helping them run the system? Are you guys actually filling out the validation yourselves? Are you guys just there and they're doing everything? You're just there to help them if something happens? Or just trying to get a feel for like how you guys are using the validation documents? All the above. All the above? Okay.
I've never even looked at it.
All wrong answers.
Yeah, I just stand.
We got to get a handle on this.
Yeah.
I usually try to tell the customer, I think, as far as the validation is concerned. We configure it, we know it's running.